Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast. My name's Will Duffin, and today I'm welcoming Nadja Albertson, who's we're speaking to from Denmark. Hello, Nadja.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good, thanks.
Great. Well, it's great to have you on the show. So Nadja, I gather you're training in geriatrics, but you're also doing a PhD in cardiac arrhythmias at the same time. And you've had a really interesting career. You've spent around 3 years working out in Greenland. You've done lots of cross-country skiing. You've crossed the ice cap of Greenland, and very interestingly, you've also spent about 13 months in total at the Concordia base on the Antarctic plateaus. It'd be great to talk about that. And you're also now working in the pandemic department, tackling COVID cases.
Yes, that's right.
So lots going on.
Yes.
And let's talk a little bit about your career to date. So have you spent most of your time in Denmark or in Greenland? Which of those countries do you prefer?
I spent most of my time working in Denmark, and I've worked in a lot of different departments, and I liked both. And I was working in Greenland from 2013 till 2016. And I think working in both places has great advantages, and right now I'm very happy about working in Denmark. But I think I'll always keep coming back to Greenland to work.
What is it about Greenland that keeps drawing you back?
Well, one thing is it's a really beautiful place. The nature is really spectacular, and the people in Greenland are wonderful. I think because of the extreme nature, the extreme place, people have a bit of a different attitude towards life in general. People very much live in the moment, which I really like. And I think when you work there as a doctor, people don't just go to the doctor whenever they have a bit of a cough or whatever. And you see, because there's so few doctors and so few different specialities, you see a lot of different things. You see a few cases of everything, but you really see everything. So you get to do a lot, try a lot, and really learn a lot. And you also learn to work independently. And I think most importantly, you also learn that you can only do so much in certain situations, because when you work in Denmark and a lot of other European countries, you get used to, you always have a cardiac surgeon or an intensive care unit. And I think you really learn a lot from working in a place where you don't have access to those kind of things. You learn dealing with that you can only do as much as you can do, if you know what I mean.
Because you've worked in some really remote parts of Greenland.
Yeah. And, sometimes you're in a situation where, if something similar happened in Denmark, for instance, you would just transfer the patient to a different department or a different hospital, and they would get treated immediately. But in Greenland, sometimes you have to wait a day or a week or even longer, depending on the weather or the situation in general. So you learn to really do as much as you can, and to overstep some boundaries as well of what you think you can do.
And what kind of clinical settings were those? Was that like a rural GP surgery, or were you also a bit of an emergency doctor as well? What kind of roles did you have?
Well, if you work in one of the bigger towns, like the capital, they have like a GP setting and an emergency room, and then they have a hospital as well. So that's a bit more like working in Denmark. But when you go to any other place, you would usually only have a GP or maybe even just a nurse station. So it would depend on the location, but usually you would be maybe 1, 2, 3 doctors, and it would mainly be GP, but also a bit of internal medicine and surgery as well.
Okay, so there's a small inpatient ward as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you, I understand you've ended up microscoping the diaphragm of a freshly shot polar bear.
Yes, that was an unexpected bonus. Um, I think it was in my first year in Greenland.
Okay.
I was stationed in one of the smaller towns, so I was the only doctor. And um, all of a sudden, the nurses started running around that a polar bear had been shot, and it was on the west coast. Usually, the polar bears are on the east coast, so it's really rare that the polar bears go there, and even more rare that they get shot. And polar bears are a really big delicacy. They really like eating them. Apparently, it's very tasty. I haven't tasted it, unfortunately, but they have a trichinosis, or they may have. So because there's no no vet,
Yes.
it's a it's a doctor's job to do the microscoping for the trichinosis.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah.
I just came there to look because they were uh, um, cutting up the animals, taking out the organs, and all of this.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
then the guy just handed me this piece of meat in a bag of potato chips, and he was like, "Here you go." And I was like, "What am I supposed to do?" So I had to Google what the trichinosis would look like in a microscope.
Wow. I have to admit, trichinosis in polar bears is something I know nothing about. What is it?
It's kind of like a parasite. If you and it's really hard to kill. So if you eat polar bear, you have to usually cook the meat for about 8 hours to be sure that it's dead. But if you get infected, it grows really slow. So once it goes to the muscles, it goes to the liver. It can also go to the brain, and once it's really settled, you can't get rid of it, and you can get really sick from it.
Wow. So before anyone eats polar bear meat, it needs to be checked for trichinosis.
Yes, otherwise cooked for like 8-10 hours or
Oh,
something.
right. Yeah. What is that? Have you eaten polar bear? What does it taste like?
I haven't.
No. Yeah. I wonder.
I took such a long time microscoping that they thought I had cooked the meat and eaten.
You missed out. I bet it tastes like chicken.
Probably.
Great. Yeah. So, and you did a lot of skiing when you were out in Greenland. Tell me about this amazing trip where you crossed the entire ice cap as part of a team of six. That sounds like it was your first real taste of real isolation.
Yes, it was, and it was. I think I think a lot of people get some kind of fascination with the ice cap when you go to Greenland. You know, you the at the main airport, you can go there, you can walk there, you can take a bus to the ice cap, and you can stand there and just look over the ice, and it just stretches forever. So, um, so it just became really attractive. But we were a group of six, and we spent 28 days crossing the ice cap on skis, and it was really, really hard. It was definitely the hardest thing ever. Um, but it was basically just skiing and pulling the sledges, sleeping in tents, and melting a lot of water. You spend so much time melting water, but you're also completely isolated apart from being in this group. You have the satellite phone where you can also do some internet connection, but you don't have any mobile phones. You don't get any news or anything. The only news we got when we were on the ice was that a prince had died. That was the only thing. Um,
Was that a nice thing, having a bit of a break from the news, or did you miss it?
I didn't miss it at all. It was actually quite nice. And I think it was also the first time I learned that you can actually be away for a month and not get any news. And once you get back, nothing has changed at all. I mean, you really don't miss out not having your phone for 30 days.
Yeah, yeah. It makes you wonder with this pandemic having just hit, if anyone is currently out there crossing the ice cap of Greenland or some other remote place, if they're going to return to civilization anytime soon, I think things will have changed a bit for them.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
It must be a big shock.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So you had all those amazing experiences in Greenland, and then you applied for the European Space Agency has a space analog, which is the Concordia station down in Antarctica, and you spent a whole 13 months on that station within a small team.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, Well, we were 13 people who spent the winter there. So that was 9 months, from February till November. And then there's the summer period in Antarctica where it gets really busy. Well, with busy, there's 100 people, so it's not that many, but compared to the 13, it really feels like a lot.
Yeah.
So the base is actually a French-Italian research station, mainly glaciology and astronomy.
Yeah.
But the European Space Agency has sponsored a water treatment unit, and that kind of gave them access to do biomedical research there, because the base is completely isolated during the winter. There's 600 kilometers to the closest neighbor, and besides that, it's also in 3,600 meters of altitude. So there's also some hypoxia there, and that makes it a really good space analog.
Wow. And when you first arrived, did you feel the altitude straight away?
I did a little bit, walking on stairs, you get some shortness of breath, and also a little bit of edema actually when I was there in the beginning. But then, you get so many input and there's so many changes, there's so many things going on that you don't really know which is which.
Yeah. And so Nadja, you were doing some research on isolation in one of the most isolated locations on Earth, that's Antarctica. Can you tell me a bit more about the project you were working on?
But they do a number of different projects, and the people in charge of the projects apply to ESA. So my role was basically just carrying out the research. It was not my projects as such, but all of the projects focuses on how people are affected by isolation and altitude. And they do it in a number of different ways. So, of course, there's a lot of interest in the psychological reactions, but there's also a lot of focus on sleep, how the muscles and bones change during the year, stress hormones, the immune system, how the body adapts to hypoxia. When you're in hypoxia for a long time, because we get to spend 13 months there instead of just walking up and down a mountain. So, and then there was one of the projects that looked at how people's navigating skills develop over the course of the winter. So we used a Soyuz simulator and different intervals between trainings to see how well people performed during the winter.
I see. It performed in what way?
By docking the Soyuz to the ISS.
Oh, wow. So it's a really technical process with the simulator. Yes. And did the performance improve or decline? What did you observe?
Well, actually, it's the only project that has done some publications now. And what they saw, they compared the people in Concordia to people at the Halley station, which is on sea level on the coast of Antarctica. Yeah. So it's also isolated, but it's they don't have the hypoxia. And then they had a control group in Stuttgart in Germany. And what they saw was that people generally performed a little bit worse in Concordia.
Right.
So what they think is that hypoxia also plays quite a big factor in how well people perform.
How interesting. I mean, we've known for a long time that in high altitude mountaineering that can really impair people's judgment, especially when they're not yet fully acclimatized. I just wonder though, if you're at 3,000 meters or thereabouts for around 13 months, surely after a few months you would have thought that people would be fully acclimatized and therefore would not have the same degree of cognitive impairment that someone ascending rapidly to altitude in a mountaineering setting would have. But that's not what you found.
No, it seems like there's some impairment at least, but it's difficult to say if it's because the sleep gets impaired because of the hypoxia. So when people have some kind of sleep deprivation, the memory and the coordination maybe declines a little bit, or if it's a direct impact of the hypoxia, we don't know.
Don't know. Did you find that your test group at altitude on Concordia slept less well than your control group in Stuttgart?
Well, actually, that data hasn't been analyzed yet.
Okay.
But what we definitely did see, even just talking in the group, was that a lot of people had sleep disturbances. Some people had it for the entire 13 months, and some people had it for just shorter periods of time.
Yeah.
I think it was the one thing that we talked about the most in Concordia was sleeping.
Yeah. And from my understanding, that's been well described in the literature, what's called periodic breathing at altitude, that kind of gasping as you at night, just to kind of do these kind of catch up breaths, because you're always slightly not quite oxygenating yourself enough.
Yeah, exactly. And that probably plays an impact. And there was actually, because, as you know, usually people, they wake up, but they don't really wake up. So they don't remember the day after. But some people actually still recognize that they were having these trouble, even at the end of the stay, that they wake up feeling a shortness of breath, even at the end of the isolation.
Yeah. And so great. So you're testing hypoxia and the impact that has on technical cognitive tasks like docking a Soyuz capsule on a simulator. Were there any other research aims of your deployment?
So that was one project, and they also did testing of like memories and coordination and motoric skills. So they've only they only done a paper on the Soyuz part now, only the docking part. So the rest will follow. And then there was a project that looked on the long-term effects of hypoxia. So that's more like biochemical, so nitrogen oxide and different hormones.
Yeah.
And then one project is looking into the microbiome in the gut and how that is affected, because we don't have any bacteria or vira in Concordia because it's too cold.
Wow. So it's basically a sterile environment.
Basically, yes. And we all eat the same food. So they think it would be really interesting to see how that affects the microbiome, and also how that affects the immune system.
Wow.
Because even in space, there are some immune disturbances of some kind. Like people get outbreaks of herpes, the labial herpes, and we actually noticed the same thing in Concordia. But it could also be stress related. And then there was a project that looked specifically on how the body composition changes and the bone density and like physical activity. Because during the winter it gets so cold that people don't go out so much. So maybe there will be some changes there. And then... Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, were you able to get any exercise or activity during the bleak midwinter in the Antarctic? Was it very difficult? Did you have facilities there to stay active?
That's a very small gym.
Okay.
There's a treadmill and a bike, and that's pretty much it. But it's there, and there's a lot of stairs. So.
Okay. Yes. And what was it like for you being cooped up in a little kind of a tiny facility for that period of time? How did that feel?
Most of the time it was fine. Time passed surprisingly fast. And well, you really have to... I mean, what I noticed, I think it was a different experience for everybody, but what I really noticed is that you get so little input from the outside. Also because you don't have a TV, the internet connection is really, really poor. So, you can't watch Netflix or whatever. So, I mean, you have to entertain yourself inside the group, and you have to really structure your day, and you have to keep yourself busy, because when you don't have any input, I think what could happen is that you kind of start thinking too much. And that's also when some of the conflicts happen, because you start thinking a bit too much what people are saying and doing and stuff like that. So I think you kind of have to, you really have to be aware of your own mood and actions and the group dynamics. But I think in general it was a really positive experience, and it's a very unique place. So just being in the place was really amazing. I also noticed that you kind of have to remind yourself, like, which is what you also have to do in daily life. You have to remind yourself that, you know, the moon is really pretty today or whatever.
Okay.
Because otherwise it just gets becomes daily life.
Yes, I see. Yeah. And you mentioned that you have to keep yourself busy. The more you kind of allow yourself to lay fallow, the more you end up kind of worrying and ruminating and generating some kind of negative energy. What kind of things, when you weren't engaged in the research, what kind of things did you and your teammates do together to pass the hours?
Well, there was a gym, obviously.
Yep.
And then books. There was a lot of books. There were, I think, because pretty much half the team is French and the other half is Italian. And then there's the ESA doctor, which is for some reason almost never Italian or French.
Yeah.
So there was some language learning going on, obviously. And then we tried to have social activities like arranging parties and stuff kind of regularly, at least once per month.
Great. Yeah.
And watching movies and kind of just, you know, doing normal stuff. But I think we also had to be aware that we had to do it, because otherwise it would just kind of, you know.
So it took a bit of self-discipline. It took a bit of motivation to really make that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. And what were the big highlights for you? You mentioned you talked there were some big rewards. What were those while you were out there?
I think just being in the position, and I think the job was really, really great. I really loved the job. But otherwise, I think it would be the only opportunity for me to go to Antarctica. So even that was special. But during the winter, it would definitely be the night sky, just sitting outside on the ice and just looking up, because there's no light pollution.
Yeah.
So you just have a full view of the night sky and the Milky Way, and it's really, you know, indescribable.
Wow. Did you have a telescope out there?
There was, but they weren't working.
Okay. No, not many people around who can fix it either, I imagine.
The astronomer really tried, but it didn't work. But just sitting there, and you're just sitting on ice, and then you just have the sky, you know, all around and above you. It's just it's really, really special.
Yeah, I bet that's really magical. Yeah. Okay. So many of the junior medics listening to this will be thinking, what an amazing gig that is to go and work out in Antarctica. Have you got any advice for them on how on earth you could get involved with a project like this?
Well, this position is up every year.
Yeah.
So that's an option. And for the Italians, they can apply to become, we were two doctors. There was a hospital doctor as well, and that's always an Italian. And so that option is there for the Italians. I think luckily the doctor who was there with me was a bit bored because there was nothing to do, but that's a good thing, obviously.
Yeah.
But otherwise, there's a lot of different bases where you can go and work. But I think, you know, just kind of look into the opportunities and just give it a shot, you know?
Yeah.
The only thing that can happen is a no.
So presumably a prerequisite for the Concordia base is you have to speak either French or Italian, I imagine.
Actually, I didn't. I spoke a little bit of Italian. Now my French is better than my Italian.
Okay.
But I didn't, which was, it was kind of a weird interview as well, because when I went to the interview, it was in Paris. And you have to do a psychological screening, and some of it is written, which was fine. But the verbal part was kind of weird because the psychologist didn't speak English. I didn't speak French. So there was a guy translating. So
yeah. Gosh, you had some fairly rigorous screening then before you were allowed out there.
Yeah.
So there are lots of other, Concordia's not alone. You mentioned the other, what are the other bases in Antarctica that require medics?
There's a lot of bases, really a lot. And I think probably all of them require medics. On the ice, like inside the plateau, there's only a few bases, and that's the Russian one, which I guess would probably be more or less impossible to go to. But then there's the American one at the South Pole. That's the Japanese one. And I think there's one more, which I can't remember. But I think having like a general, like an experience of general medicine would be really good, and also some pre-hospital experience.
Yeah.
And I know that my experience from Greenland was one of the things that helped me get the position.
Sure. And did you have any medical emergencies while you're out there, or was fortunately did everything go? Was it fairly quiet on the medical front?
It was quiet, luckily. Well, not luckily, but thankfully, because it gets so cold. It gets down to, with the wind chill, it gets down to a 100 minus degrees in the winter. So people get hypothermia really, really fast if something happens. During the winter, everybody carries a radio outside and then has GPS, and everybody has to check in regularly, like every 15 or 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And at one point, we kind of lost contact to one of the glaciologists. So we started, I was in charge of the rescue team. So we started calling in the rescue team to go look for him because we have the GPS, but he was part of the rescue team. So he called in and said, well, I'm kind of busy right now, so I can't come. I was like, okay, he's fine. So that was the closest thing to an emergency we had.
Yeah, I see. And what kind of emergencies are you prepared for in previous from previous experience? What kind of things had they prepared you to be able to handle?
Well, actually, most of the training is kind of just evacuating people back inside the base, because that's the main thing, is getting people inside before they develop hypothermia. But the hospital has dental equipment, it has some surgery equipment, there's even a respirator in the hospital. So we can actually do quite a lot of things. And it's in the surgery lab, there's a video, so we can do telemedicine with one of the big hospitals in Rome. So we're also able to get a bit of backup. But the problem is that if something happens during the winter, we can't get the patient out. So even if we can put the patient on assisted breathing if it's needed, we can't get the patient to an intensive care unit or whatever.
So you have the ability out there to intubate and paralyze and ventilate a patient.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. But you could get stuck there for quite a while.
Has that ever happened?
No, not to my knowledge. No.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. I mean, there's some amazing stories, aren't there? I mean, the famous one is the Russian doctor Leonid Rogozov, who performed an autoappendicectomy out in Antarctica. That's the famous story, using a system of mirrors and infiltrating with local anesthetic as he went, and he kept fainting throughout the procedure, and his assistants had to keep slapping around the face and waking him up again so he could complete. And he did it. It's just it's amazing. This was back in Soviet era Russia. This is a long time ago. But are you aware of any other kind of outlandish medical things that have happened out in the Antarctic like that in recent times?
No, not really. But I think that's why we're two doctors.
Right.
Something like that should happen. No, I think that's a story from the South Pole with a doctor who developed breast cancer, where they kind of airdropped the medication into her, and that's kind of it. But the appendicitis story is kind of extreme.
It's quite extreme. It's quite exceptional, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure what's worth, doing it on yourself or having your colleague who's not in any way surgically trained having a go on you. Take your pick.
Yeah, exactly. I was a bit more worried for my colleague if I had to be his doctor. He was quite experienced. Yes.
And between you, did you have your bases covered? Were you both doctors, or was your colleague kind of a different specialty or different branch of healthcare, or how did they pair the two medics together on Concordia?
Actually, I don't think they put a lot of thought into it, actually, because they don't select us together. But I think we were quite a good team, because he came from a leading position in an emergency ward. Yeah. So he's a trauma surgeon. So that part he was quite used to. And I'm more like a general medicine kind of thing, and geriatrics and internal medicine. Yeah. So I think we complemented quite well, and we worked really well together as well.
Great. I mean, that must make such a difference over the course of 13 months to have a good working relationship.
Absolutely. And it was actually
Yeah.
really nice also your question about passing time, because he had time to, give me lessons in ultrasounds and stuff like that. So that was really
Great.
nice.
So you talk stuff to each other. That's great. So let's move on to your current role, which is in the pandemic unit. So you're in Denmark. You've got COVID patients coming in. Tell me what that involves. That entails.
I think it's different in the different regions of Denmark how they chose to handle the situation, and the region I live in is the least affected, at least so far, and thankfully.
Yeah.
And we have 7 different departments, and the ones I'm working in is the kind of like the pre-hospital department where we do the swabbing, the throat swabs, and like a triage. So we kind of do the screening of the patient and decides if anybody has to go like further in and get blood samples and x-rays and stuff like that done and needs to be admitted to the hospital. And then I also work in the intermediary department, so people who needs to be hospitalized but are not, sick enough to be in the intensive care unit. And then I also work in the department where people go like post-intensive care. So
Yeah.
the step where they're once again stable but not well enough to go home.
I see. And how are you finding this pandemic so far?
I think it's a really special work situation to be in, because not only do we not really know like the development of the disease, like we don't know how the patient is going to react like when they're in the hospital. Like we know that they are probably going to crash if they crash around day 7 or day 10 and then start getting better, but we still have so few cases that we're kind of learning as we go along.
Yeah.
And I think we had quite a few situations where we think, okay, now the patient is ready to go home, and then the next day it just looks completely different. So we're just really being very careful with everybody. So that's one thing. One thing is that we, there's so much uncertainty about the disease.
Yeah.
But the other thing is also there's so much uncertainty about the work situation, because right now they are just taking people from everywhere. A lot of us are volunteering, and we don't know like what the work schedule is going to be next week, because we don't know how many patients are going to be there.
Yeah.
So there's so much uncertainty and so much frustration because of that as well. And that's just something that we have to deal with as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That really mirrors how things are for us in the UK, and certainly me as a GP. I mean, I've never done so much reading before a surgery before. It's so much new data coming out from Wuhan in China and now Italy. They're a more advanced stage than both our respective countries. And it's so hard to know how you can extrapolate that data into different health system, different population and different health policies in place. It's wow. And it's just constantly changing our understanding of this disease and how it affects people. And it's just, it's really, really challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really is.
I'm finding, my GP colleagues and our role is constantly changing, and we just don't really know from one week to the next what kind of how we're going to be working. We've ditched all our routine work. We're doing mostly telephone triage system now, and we're dividing COVID and non-COVID. But then next week there'll be so much COVID around that everyone will just be just presumed COVID. It's just a complete maelstrom, if I'm honest. But it's great to know that we're not alone, that you're feeling that in Denmark as well.
Well, absolutely. And like nobody knows if it's going to be like 1 more month or 3 months or a year. And, should we go for herd immunity or shouldn't we? And, the sensitivity of the test and the number of people you're testing, and, it's kind of chaotic really in a way.
It really is. And what's the mood in Denmark amongst the general public? Are people quite fearful of COVID? Is there a huge sense of apprehension, or is there a real sense of camaraderie and we're all in this together? How would you describe how the kind of country is feeling as a whole, if you could?
I think there's a bit of everything, really.
Yeah.
I think there's a really, really great sense of camaraderie, especially in the beginning. I think it's starting to fade out a little bit. Also because, you obviously know the two curves, you have the really steep one, and then you have the more flat one, which is the one everybody is going for, of
Yes.
course.
Yeah.
And I think in the beginning, everybody was fearing the really steep one. So like the population really stood together and the camaraderie was really there. And then it didn't happen. And I think that kind of left people, also a little bit, this uncertainty.
Yeah.
So it's kind of slipping apart a little bit. And I think there's a little bit of frustration starting to grow, like a frustration about the isolation and plans for the summer not happening anyways.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also definitely a lot of fear, especially among the people who are in the risk groups, like the elderly and the chronically ill. So I think there's a little bit of everything. And of course also, which you probably also notice as a GP, like the people who have anxiety. Like I think it's a really, really difficult period for them.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I think, but we already had an epidemic of loneliness and mental health problems before this pandemic, and this has really, this will huge. It's a huge surge in levels of anxiety moving forwards. And the thing that's worrying me more than anything at the moment is the management of non-COVID disease, how that's impacted on by this pandemic. All routine hospital appointments have been postponed. There's very, very little routine chronic disease management. I do feel like we're storing up this time bomb. We're going to see at the tail end of this a lot of patients unraveling, lots of diseases presenting at a late stage that were not managed because of everything being parked during the pandemic. And I think that's when, certainly in primary care, it's really going to hit us.
And we see the same in the hospitals. There's not that many emergency admission with like people with acute coronary disease or people who have to be screened for cancer. And we're getting really worried in the hospital about where the patients are, because
absolutely
they should be there.
Yeah, absolutely. And presumably the health policy in Denmark is similar to UK. Is it are you currently in lockdown? Yeah, and vulnerable groups are being shielded.
We're on a lockdown. There's nobody being, they're supposed to be shielded, but there's no particular rules for anyone. And according to plan, we're going to start opening up next week around the 15th. So they're going to start letting the small children go back to like daycare and also back to school. So up to 5th grade.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, it was a very controversial move in the UK, closing all the schools. The impact that has on, there's very weak evidence to show that really impacts the spread of coronavirus. But I suppose the caveat to that is we don't fully understand the role that children play. We know they get mild disease, but we don't know how much viral shedding and how much truly the children, young people are responsible for the spread of the pandemic. So I suppose it seems like a prudent move, but it's very interesting to hear that is the first easing in lockdown measures that your country is considering, and I wonder whether the UK will also follow in the same vein.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, we can see in about 3 or 4 weeks how it's going to affect.
Absolutely. And so we're all experiencing a new kind of isolation with lockdown. Many of us many people are self-isolating, so they're not able to go out at all for 14 days, so they live with someone who's got symptoms. From your experience so far of the isolation of lockdown, how does that relate to the isolation you experienced in Antarctica? Which of those were they different challenges? Which of those do you feel was easier, harder, and why?
I think they're very different, actually, and I think that this one is probably the more difficult. In Concordia, you had the physical isolation. Like if you wanted to leave, you would have to go out in the cold and then you would die. And, you know, you knew that if you started walking, that would be the consequence. So it was really hands-on, like the consequence was really hands-on. And we also knew that the isolation would start in February and it would end in November. And that's it. And we also choose to go. We had some kind of motivation. And with the COVID-19, it was just kind of, you know, put on people, and nobody knows when it's really going to end, if it's going to end and then start all over. And I think the consequence is a bit more vague, because if you break the isolation, you know, maybe you get infected, maybe you don't get infected, maybe you know, pass the disease to someone else, maybe you don't. It's a lot more vague. And then I think also with the COVID-19, when you're being isolated, you're really missing out on things. In Concordia, you know, you were not going to go to a party, you know, anyways, outside the base, right? So I think that makes it a lot more difficult. And then I think especially the predictability is a big issue, at least for me it is.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose you knew you were going to get out of there at a set point in time, whereas in this instance, we just don't know at all, do we?
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Do you think that Concordia has prepared you for life in lockdown Denmark? Do you feel better prepared than most?
For sure. Also, I think, you know, when things got hard in Concordia, you knew it's going to end, but you know, there you had a date. But even now, you know, I still know it's going to end at some point. It's only temporary. Okay. So, and I think that helps me a lot. And also, I know that missing out on things for even 13 months is okay, you know. And you can still Skype, and you can still use WhatsApp and email and whatever. So, you know, I tried it. It's okay. It worked out, and I think it's also a really good chance to kind of sit back and not have as many inputs as usual, and then you just kind of realize, you know, the important things in life. It sounds kind of hippie-ish, but I think you kind of get a different perspective on the important things in life and the important people.
No, absolutely. And what are the important things in life for you, Nadja?
Licorice. No.
Licorice.
Definitely my friends and family. Yeah, I think in Concordia, I really, you know, you kind of sort of out a lot of noise, and I really realized how fortunate I am with you know, with everything. And I think that's a possibility to do as well under the COVID-19 isolation. But then I'm also aware that everybody is having different experiences, and some people are finding it a lot more difficult. And, you know, also when you're working from home, you have small kids, you have to homeschool as well and whatever, it can be super stressful.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's really interesting what you're saying about inputs. And I feel like modern life, we are constantly chasing our own tail. We're taking on way too much, especially medics. We're the worst for it. And we're just always future focused, just thinking about what's coming up next. And we never really engineer an opportunity to stop and just take in where we are. And I think it's really interesting. You're pointing to this pandemic as an opportunity for us to do that, as an opportunity for us to really just regroup and think about what's important to us, what gives us joy and satisfaction. And you know, for you, it sounds like that's friends and family, and being able to speak to them and know that they're there. And I think that's really, really, really amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's, in a way, it's been a good training for my family as well, that I was in Antarctica. You know, they experienced, you know, having people at a distance before as well. So I think maybe it helped them cope a little bit as well during
of course
this pandemic. So
they were already quite, well, presumably in Concordia, you couldn't even do video calls. It was all just voice.
Yeah.
So at least this is a little bit easier.
It is. For sure.
Yeah. Great. Well, Nadja, it's been really great to chat to you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
If people want to reach out to you for any questions, how could they do that?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, or
Yeah.
I also have a homepage, so they can just Google me. That's fine.
So if they Google your name, you'll pop up on the first hit.
Maybe.
Okay. Great. Well, it's been great chatting to you. Pleasure having you on the podcast. Wish you all the best and good luck with the COVID unit moving forwards. And I hope you have an easy run of it.
Thank you, and back at you.
Great. Okay. Bye for now.